The story of my family is very much one of capricious events. So on the screen you see my father, Johann Tschinkel, Hans was his nickname. He was born in 1907 in Linz, Austria, and my mother, Lotte, originally Nagel, who was born in the vicinity of Vienna, a suburb of Vienna. So both of them were born in the old Austrian Empire and were citizens of that empire. My mother, in her later years, when American politics got too complicated for her, she would say, "I want my Kaiser back." And I think she meant it. Let me give you a very brief background of family history because, well, I'll try to keep it short because, of course, excuse me, we're really here to hear about World War II. The Tschenkels were actually from, the family name comes from Croatia, from northern Yugoslavia. And by the early 1700s, the Tschenkels had migrated to what is currently the Czech Republic as first itinerant peddlers, and then my great-great-great-great-grandfather, during the Napoleonic blockade, made a fortune by making substitute coffee out of chicory, and then went into all kinds of other businesses and became immensely wealthy. And the family lived on that wealth for several generations until finally, well, I'll tell you that story in a minute. My mother, on the other hand, was the daughter of a union between a Jewish Austrian army officer and a lady from Hamburg. So in Europe, that was really extremes. That's, that was unheard of. So this is my great-great-grandfather who made all the money. And there's a little advertisement for his coffee. The fortune survived a few generations, and then in the 30s, early 30s, I think it was, the last of the fortune was squandered away by a relative of my father's. He saw practically none of it. By speculating on hops. This family was living largely in a little town called Zatz in what's currently the Czech Republic. This is a big hops and beer brewing region. And the business of hops, you could make millions and millions of dollars, not dollars, sorry, Reichsmark, by buying up the hops, holding it in a warehouse, and then as the demand during the brewing season advanced, the price would go up, until very suddenly, when the brewers were saturated, it would drop to practically zero. So this lady here, the maternal, let's see, it's actually Marie, the grandmother, blew the fortune, the last of the fortune, on speculating on hops. So my father got none of it. He went to university first in Vienna, and when the money ran out, he came home and finished his doctoral degree at the university in Prague, at the Charles University, one of the oldest universities in Europe. So here he is in his graduating class in high school. You can see the class was small. There was a tremendous influence by his professors for his entire life, especially the biology professor. I think my father was really a frustrated biologist, one reason why he enjoyed my profession. He was a member of an entirely youth organization called the Wandervogel, which means migratory birds. And this was a very romantically oriented organization that did a lot of hiking and a lot of cultural kind of involvement and so on. I don't think it sees a counterpart in modern, certainly not in modern Germany, and maybe ever. So this is the town square of Zatz, the town where he grew up. And the next slide shows you the town in 1990 when Vicki and I visited there with our daughter. There you see it. That's my daughter on the shoulders there. And that lower inset is there because, I'm not sure you can make it out, but those are hops growing there right in the middle of the town, all right? I think they're symbolic hops. So these are the maternal grandparents, my mother's mother and my grandfather. Being a Jewish officer in the Austrian army was highly unusual. But he came from an unusual family anyway. It was a very successful Hungarian Jewish family. They had important cultural figures in it, the mathematicians, and they were actually related to the Pulitzers of the Pulitzer Prize. And one of them was the personal physician of Franz Joseph II, the Emperor of Austria. So a very illustrious family. My maternal grandmother, on the other hand, well, we'll keep those stories for later, maybe. She was, never mind. There's a half-sister, though. Let's put it there, okay? So this was her family. Amy, you will see, the middle child there is about 10 years older than the other two, and that's a half-sister. She's the half-sister to my mother and her sister. There's more sort of scandal in the family, and the family had to flee to, we believe it was fleeing to the United States of America on account of some kind of a construction accident or scandal. And my grandfather disappeared in the dark of the night, and they all popped up in Hoboken, New Jersey again. So my aunt, Ethel, was actually born in New Haven. So she was a native-born American citizen, although she lived in Switzerland for most of her life. So they settled in the town of Teplitz-Schönau, which is on the border of Czechoslovakia and Germany, that time still Austria. And they settled there because here's another one of those capricious things, because on the ship coming back from America to Europe, the grandfather made friends with somebody who said that Teplitz was just a wonderful place to live. It's a spa town, okay? So he decided, okay, we're going to live there. So they did, and that's where my mother grew up. In the First World War, he'd had health problems, but he volunteered, and he insisted on being an officer in the Austrian army. He was very patriotic. And his bosses sent him to this fortress in Poland, the Przemysl, which they said there was never going to be any action there, so this frail guy would not be in any danger. But of course, one of the major sieges of the First World War took place there, and it fell to the Russians, and he was a prisoner of war for several years. Maybe I should sort of can the early stories and go on to, I mean, this is going to go on forever, isn't it? But he faked an illness, stomach cancer. I don't know how he did it, but he did, and he was traded for, prisoner of war trade, arrived back in Austria, I think before the end of the war. So my mother was unusual in that she graduated from the gymnasium, which was at that time it was practically all male. So she was one of only two female students, and not in the Humanistischen Gymnasium, which was the sort of college-bound high school in Europe at that time. She worked as a secretary and assistant, as you see here, for a construction firm, and then eventually married my father. There she is, a good-looking, fashionable young woman. The parents met on a ski vacation and got married, and now we get closer to the theme of this whole group, I suppose, World War II. We were living at the time in Lobositz, which is in the Sudetenland, as it was called. It's on the Elbe River. It's the borderland between Czechoslovakia, at that time Czechoslovakia, and Germany. And what a lot of people don't know is that this was a problem created largely at the Treaty of Versailles, when a largely German area was ceded to the new nation Czechoslovakia. The area, a lot of people think that the Germans were recent interlopers in that area, but that's not true. The German farmers were invited in the year 900 to 1000 by the Bohemian kings to colonize that area, and German farmers were very good colonizers. So Germans had lived in that area for almost 1,000 years. They're not newcomers, okay? So when the Treaty of Versailles drew the political boundaries the way it did, they basically created the subsequent problem. And so next slide shows you that German border area. That purple area, the town of Lobositz is where I was born, where we were living at the time. And we were living there because my father had a job as a chemist. He was a trained organic chemist. He was working in a factory that made paint bases from vegetable oils, mostly rapeseed. I guess nowadays that's called canola. It's a euphemized name. It was called Rappen of German. And so the purple area was the Sudeten German area that was then taken over by the Nazis, by Germany, in the Treaty of Munich in 1938. And so I was actually born a citizen of Greater Germany, not of Czechoslovakia. The history of the Germans and the Czechs in that area had gotten, there was more and more friction, especially, of course, the Nazis did their best to increase that. And that's really how the problem came into being. The industry was largely, almost exclusively in German hands, and the Czech government had been sort of moving people into that area, and so the inevitable frictions led to all kinds of incidents. The history of Germany is very complicated because for many, many years there were a lot of small feudal states that were gradually amalgamated, and Prussia was itself an amalgamation of Brandenburg and several other of those duchies and kingdoms. So, modern Germany came into existence under Bismarck in 1871, I believe. And but this is Germany as it was in 1940, after the Germans had annexed Austria and invaded Poland and taken over Czechoslovakia. So it's a lot bigger than it is. And you can see that where Lobositz is located. Yes?
One of the things most people are not aware of is that many of the boundaries of the Versailles Treaty were done by American geography professors who literally took maps of Europe and the Middle East and put them on the floor, took crayons and drew boundaries. And they, cut tribal lines, they cut, historical groupings and so on, because they really were very naive.
Right.
But basically, literally, they were on hands and knees with crayons.
It's all terribly familiar, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's been done so many times, Just think about Iraq or, wherever, India or whatever, It's always the same.
But that's why you had these odd things like the Sudeten Germans being part of Czechoslovakia, where they were ethnically German for 1,000 years.
Right. A little knowledge goes a long ways. The region is bounded on the northwest and the southwest by mountains. That's what separates it from regular Germany. And a lot of it is quite attractive. It's a very lovely landscape, and this is just one example of the mountain landscape nearby. So there's the young couple during courtship, and then shortly after they're married, and then almost 50 years later. This is the vegetable oil factory where my father worked. I took this picture in 1990. The factory was still there. It was my first visit to my birth town ever. So that was, 50 years later? And this is the house I was born in, the House Germania. There's an ironic story attached to this. This once belonged to the Tschinkel family. And I think it was the Tschinkels that started the oil factory too, a long time ago. And then when they squandered all that fortune, of course, the house passed into other hands, and we were renters in this house, the house that had once belonged to Tschinkels, and the house I was born in. That's my daughter there, that little girl. She was at the time only 3 years old. That's the house from a different angle. Just across the street is the Delhi Chocolate Factory, also a creation of the Tschinkels, a long time ago, and still in existence at the time when the wall came down. And the sad part is that about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, the Delhi Chocolate Factory, one of the few successful enterprises in communist Czechoslovakia, expanded and tore down the house I was born in. So there it goes. The war broke out, as you know, in the late 30s, and my father was drafted not once but 3 times. His boss would convince the authorities that he was necessary for the defense effort at home, since he was a chemist making paint bases, drying oils. And so he'd get him out and posted back home. And then he'd get drafted again, and so on and so forth. The second time he got drafted, he was posted to the barrage balloons outside the city of Berlin. These are hydrogen-filled balloons, not helium, dangerous hydrogen-filled balloons that were led up on cables to many tens of thousands of feet in order to entangle approaching aircraft. It was an anti-bomber strategy. And being a chemist, of course, he was very involved in all these kinds of things. But it was mostly a period of long, long waits and boredom, and he wrote poetry and did all kinds of stuff. He was a creative guy. So then he had a bunch of kids. The first one was not born in wartime. It's my brother Henry. But the other 2 were born in wartime. You kind of scratch your head and you think, well, must have been pretty optimistic. But you never know, right? So there we are, 1942. That dopey one is my sister, the one in the middle. The bright-looking one on the left is me. Okay. So life in Lobositz in the early war years was actually pretty normal, and that's my brother on his first day of school. The tradition was that you got a paper cone full of sweets, so that's Zuckertüte as it was known. And I'm showing the lifetime early interests in eating and biology preferably combined with the cake and the flowers. We had relatives nearby in the town of Bodenbach up the Elbe River. Was my, actually half-aunt and half-uncle. That's the sister, my mother's sister, Amy. My father was an only child. And we would visit them. They had a factory that made colored papers, glazed papers, like wrapping papers, and other kinds of paper. Very neat business. And they had 8 children. So I had 8 first cousins, 8 first half-cousins, which is a lot, and they were my only relatives. So I don't remember visiting that, but my brother remembers it very positively. And actually it was a fun family. I met them later. My grandmother lived in Zatz, where my father had grown up, and this is a visit to her. Looks very old-fashioned European, doesn't it? Probably because it was. Our transportation in that time was this so-called Leiterwagen. Leiter is a ladder, because the sides look like a ladder. This was fashioned for us by a carpenter. It was made to order. And this is how we got around. My mother would be the mule, and we transported goods and children and everything around the town that way. Okay, so that's outside Berlin, was where my father was first stationed as in the barrage balloon. So then on the third and final draft, he was given the choice. We can either post you somewhere near home in an anti-aircraft unit. He was in the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. Or we can post you in uniform to Peenemuende. Well, they didn't name it. They said to this hush-hush place where you would be working in your own profession. And they didn't specify what that was. It was a top-secret development, obviously. And it turned out that, well, he took that choice. He made that choice. There's the capriciousness again. And it turned out to be the Rocket Development Center at Peenemuende, on the Baltic Sea at the mouth of the Oder River. And at that point, they were developing several different rockets, the so-called A4, Aggregate 4, which was later called the V2, the V1, the buzz bomb, and the Wasserfall, which was an anti-aircraft rocket. And if they had stuck to that one, they probably would have done a lot better in the war. But, lots of bad decisions were made. So let me then sort of review the history of the V2 project and Peenemuende briefly, ending with how it came to an end. So that's the location of Peenemuende. You see it's up there on the Baltic Sea. The Peenemuende is actually, Peene was a river. It's a distributary of the Oder. And Munde just means mouth, so that's the mouth of the Peene River. There's another one, the Svine, which is Svinemünde, which is nearby. They were fishing villages in the 1930s. And they were chosen because of their remoteness and, well, because of their remoteness. Also because they were on the Baltic Sea, good test range for firing rockets. The man behind all this, the brains behind this, not the money, but the brains, was Werner von Braun, who was a child prodigy, basically, of aristocratic Prussian stock, the Junker family, so-called Junkers. These were landed aristocracy. And he showed an early interest and talent for physics, and he became a doctorate of physics at a very young age. I don't remember what it was, but the guy was really smart. And he got interested in rocketry through the writings of a man named Hermann Obert, and conceived the idea that one could shoot rockets into space. The difference was that most of the rocketry that had been done was solid fuel rocketry that had been invented by the Chinese 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. But these were liquid-fueled rockets, and that was a major difference and required a lot of technology to tame. It was obviously very dangerous. So I don't know if you can see this well enough, but the V2 was mostly fuel and oxidizer tanks. It ran on ethanol, ethyl alcohol, which was made from fermenting potatoes. So, every gram of alcohol in that rocket was somebody's food. And because it carried liquid oxygen as an oxidizer, like all rockets, the propulsion works in space where there's no air. That's a critical feature, of course. The fuel and the oxidizer are pumped into the combustion chambers. You see those little knobs on top of the combustion chamber on your right. Those are the injectors. There's a diffuser plate, and the oxygen and the alcohol combine to burn at very high temperatures, and the exhaust stream is then allowed to expand in that cone that sits at the bottom of the rocket. And it's the vectors pushing against that cone that propels the rocket upward. So that stream of high supersonic stream of gas coming out is what propels the rocket. The warhead is carried on the top, and you can see it's relatively small. Big enough, though. And there's a lot of machinery involved in pumping and in stabilizing and guiding the rocket during its initial burn stage. So the gyroscope sits in just behind the warhead, and that feeds information to the vanes down below the exhaust. The V2 was steered by moving carbon vanes that were residing in the exhaust stream. Now, modern rockets don't work that way. The engine is actually gimbaled in a modern rocket, so the whole engine swivels. And if you've ever seen a launch of something like the Saturn or one of those big rockets, you can see that as it rises, the engine is gimbaling all the time. So, but that wasn't yet done that way. Then the burn time on a V2, this is a huge rocket now, I mean not by modern standards, but it was by then, was about 1 minute. So all of that liquid oxygen and alcohol were combusted in the period of 60 seconds. Now you can imagine the pumping required for that. That's a lot of energy. The energy for that pumping is derived from that little, you see a little sphere there just below the liquid oxygen tank? There's a little sphere that says hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen, 98%, I think it was 90% hydrogen peroxide was decomposed over a catalyst, I think potassium permanganate or manganese dioxide or something like that, to produce high temperature steam and oxygen, which drove the turbines that pumped the alcohol and the oxygen into the combustion chamber. If you think about that for a minute, you see it's a hell of a lot of engineering. And the V2 was not a rocket derived from modeling and theoretical work. It was very much empirical. The production and development had to be so fast that there wasn't time to do a lot of theoretical physics calculations in background. It was largely trial and error. And there were huge numbers of failures. Somebody said they had films here. Who was it? Yeah, you said you had films. I mean, I've seen those films too. The rocket's going, boom, it blows up. And then it goes, plow, you know. And every time it blows up, you know, there's several tons of alcohol and liquid oxygen that go up in a burst of flame. So here's a picture of a V2 being launched. It looks like so far successfully. And in the foreground you see what's called a Meilerwagen. That's the way the missile was transported. It was a mobile missile. It was not one that had to be launched from one point. It could be moved by train. The special kind of train car could be launched on the tracks, or it could be moved by these trucks. Peenemuende generated a lot of interest among the brass, the military and the Nazi brass. So there was a constant stream of visitors, and my father told stories of various Nazis showing up, like Hermann Göring in his red leather hunting boots and drunk as a skunk, and and all these funny stories, and how they would all seriously always would do these demonstrations, and when Göring visited, apparently they all went kablooey. And at the end they asked him, well, what would you like us to put our money into, and or your money, I guess it was, and he said, well, I can say it in German, but it wouldn't mean anything. But translated, it says, well, you're asking a lot from me. First, you fart around for me a few times, and everything goes kablooey, and then you want me, poor pig, to make these big decisions for you. So, anyway, so that's von Braun there with some Nazi brass. Next slide shows that's Himmler, not a very nice guy, as you know, a chicken farmer turned mass murderer. And anyway, there were lots and lots of these people that came through all the time. My father's specialty was, did I mention that? He was the one that was doing the hydrogen peroxide. Propulsion and fuels was his, because he's a chemist, was his specialty. So he was in charge of developing not only these the turbine fuel, but also designing combustion chambers and studying efficient combustion and all these kinds of things associated with that. He considers his, well, as a background, the V2 fuel, the alcohol was highly denatured. It was had added to it pyridine. If anybody's ever smelled pyridine, it's an acrid, bitter sort of odor and toxic, and methyl alcohol and all kinds of other denaturants so that it was not drinkable. My father considered his greatest accomplishment in the V2, in the Peenemuende period, to be repurifying V2 fuel so that it could be drunk. And in fact, it turned out to be something quite important. Less important was that once he received a visit from von Braun and his staff, and he was all Twitter, you know, and he showed him everything in the lab, and he was very proud of everything he'd done. And von Braun listened patiently, hands behind his back. And finally he said, well, Tschinkel, he said, that's all very interesting, but We hear you make an excellent coffee liqueur. But actually, that alcohol turned out later to be a lifesaver. Because when, as you'll see, when the project fled Peenemuende, my father took along a number of liters of it, and it could be under the conditions of the collapse of Germany, when money was worth nothing, it could be traded for food or for anything else that was needed, favors or food and so on. And we converted a good deal of that alcohol into benefit for the family ultimately. I mean, farmers would be very willing to trade. Farmers were often the only people that had food, so they were often very willing to trade alcohol for food. Here you see the V2 being erected on one of these Meilerwagen. It looks here as though it's just this one truck, but in fact the support for launching a V2 was very large. It was a very complicated business, as Americans later discovered when they captured a number of these V2s. This is a photograph signed by von Braun and Konrad Dannenberg, who was the military head of the organization. 1942, a successful launch. So I think this might have been one of the early successful ones. I don't remember the timeline exactly, but it took a while before they got it so that at least a few of them would fly properly. So here you see a rocket being launched in the distance, and my father says they used to sit on the dunes just outside. There were 8 or 9 test stands, and they'd sit sort of just in the woods or on the edge of the test stands. These big hollow bowls with moats around them. And one day one of them went right over their heads and exploded behind them, and then they sort of started getting the idea maybe it wasn't the safest place to be. They were a little dense. They had bunkers. Yes, the control house was a bunker, a very simple bunker, but very small, yeah. So the British especially were then involved in what in the world was going on at this facility on the Baltic Sea. And the story of how they figured it out is quite an interesting one. It's an exciting sort of spy and intelligence story. It was called Operation Crossbow. And through interpretation of aerial photographs, plus evidence from Polish, what do you call those? Polish resistance fighters who had discovered parts of some of the missiles that had fallen into Poland by accident. They did figure out that it was some kind of a rocket development place. So there's a picture that was kind of key. You see that rocket lying on its side. The inset shows it in detail. And they figured out that something important and big was going on there. So in 1943, they launched a major air raid against Peenemuende. Bombing lasted, I don't know, a couple of hours, I think. My father had just been posted there. He arrived there in early 1943, so he lived through this air raid. And when they heard the bombers coming, most people ran to the trenches. There were air raid trenches to shelter in. And the raid was devastating, as you can see here. This is one of the main buildings that was hit. Most of the fatalities, unfortunately, were in strikes on the workers' barracks. There were a lot of workers, both forced labor and native Germans, and there were something like 600 fatalities by the destruction of these barracks. That's part of the development facilities, and the next slide shows the before and after of the workers' quarters. So actually only one of the technical people, Dr. Thiele, he and his family were both killed in the raid, but other than that, technical people survived. The story, my father, ever analytical, reports that during the raid, they were in the trench, and sound travels more quickly through media of higher density. So it's slow in air but fast in a solid. So they're sitting in a trench, which is more or less solid earth, so that the explosions of the bombs could be felt. As he said, it sounded like tuck, 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 long before the sound actually approached, and they could hear these tuck, 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 coming closer and closer and closer. Finally just stopped just short of their trench. So, another 100 meters or so, and they would have been toast. So, but that notion of the knowledge that you could hear the sound through the soil before you heard it in the air, that was typical of my father. He was always analyzing things in that sort of way. Not that, I'm about to die. That I'm just stuck in because that's Peenemuende today. When the Russians took it over, they basically destroyed all the buildings, all the facilities, and turned it back into cow pasture. So one of the consequences of the raid on Peenemuende was to move the manufacturing to an old mine in the Harz Mountains, the so-called Mittelbau. And this is an ugly story. I mean, not too much of World War II is pretty, but this is particularly ugly. The next slide shows you the underground. That's the entrance to the mine you see there. This is a plan of the mine. They're long corridors with cross tunnels. I don't remember what was mined there, but basically the Nazis set up a manufacturing factory for the V2 to produce it in large numbers, using largely slave labor. There was a concentration camp right outside called in the town of Nordhausen called Camp Dora. It's been in the news a lot lately. And the numbers of prisoners there swelled from around a few thousand early on to over 20,000, with high numbers of fatalities and often deportations to the death camps and so on and so forth. So that was a very ugly business. This is after the Americans took over. You can see an American MP, I guess, next to a partly assembled V2 rocket. So these are the V2 engines stockpiled outside the Mittelbau. There's a partly assembled rockets in the tunnels, and the next slide shows you the tunnel condition today. There's Camp Dora has been made a monument. Germany is full of these kinds of what they call Denkanstalt, memorials that ask people to think about the history that's happened there. So you see a V2 engine there in the partly collapsed tunnels. I think the Russians may have tried to blast this. My father, in his later years, there was, the German rocket group, the basis of the American space program they were hailed as all these great geniuses because of the Americans were early in space. But later on, there was a lot of question about the Nazi connections and whether some of these people had been involved in war crimes or other things of that nature. And one man especially, a man named Rudolf, was accused of having been in part responsible for the use of and the abuse of slave labor in the Mittelbau. He was a liaison between Peenemuende and the Mittelbau. And he was eventually forced to give up his citizenship, return to Germany, and proclaimed his innocence throughout. Who knows? But my father had once visited the Mittelbau and seen conditions there, and when this started blowing up, he was very worried that they'd come after him too. I think that was excessively sensitive because he'd had no role in that whatsoever. We were living in Lobositz at that time. We were never up in Peenemuende. Some families were. I had friends that lived up there. So by 1945, actually, my father and his friends say that when they heard about Stalingrad in 1942, December, that they knew it was over. It was just a matter of time. And of course, that turned out to be true. But by 1945, things were becoming very dire. And as the Russians approached Peenemuende, the technical people, and this was largely the work of 2 or 3 people like Kurt Debus and von Braun and a few others, decided they did not want to fall to the Russians. So they sold the. I need to back up a moment. The Peenemuende had been under the Wehrmacht, that is the army, for most of its time. But late in the war, there was always infighting among the Nazis. Late in the war, the SS took over Peenemuende, and the commander was a man named Kammler, who was apparently just a criminal, basically. And he wanted every man, woman, and child at Peenemuende to defend to the last moment against the Russians. So they had to hatch a scheme that would be irresistible to these SS guys. So they said, we need to move the project to a safer zone so that we can continue development of the rocket and achieve ultimate victory. The phrase ultimate victory, of course, was one of those triggers that worked for Nazis, I guess. So they came up with a plan to move the entire operation, lock, stock, and barrel, to southern Germany, to a less strategic zone. And they did just that. And it's an amazing story. I mean, if you can imagine moving something like that. And they actually also took up doing experiments in southern Germany once they had moved the whole outfit. So toward the very end of the war. And then this put them into striking distance to the Americans. The Americans were clearly going to take that part of Germany, and they were then able to surrender themselves to the Americans. So that's the story from here on. Peenemuende at the top there, and this shows the path that the caravan or caravans took. From Peenemuende down to the Harz Mountains, which is where Mittelbau was, and there a man named Hutzel, Dieter Hutzel, was in charge of hiding 13 tons of V2 documents. Now this was critical. These people believed in the technology that they had developed. It was highly valuable to them. That's what they did. That's what they spent years of their lives doing. So to lose that would have been tragic to them. So they took 13 tons of documents and hid them in an old mine and then blasted the mouth shut. And these they later showed to the Americans. So that's that little detour that you see where it says hidden documents. And then they went on south to an area in the Thuringian forest that's a low mountain range. There were slate quarries there. Slate is the big business there. And in one of these slate quarries, or several of them, they set up test stands and went through the motions of developing the rocket. My father, of course, was busy redistilling the V2 fuel so that it could be drunk. Because by this time, I'm sure everybody needed a good stiff drink. And he took a few days' leave as this caravan was moving south. And mind you, you have to imagine getting the vehicles, getting the fuel, and getting the permissions to do this. These were no small feats, because fuel was practically impossible to get. Vehicles had to be commandeered through various subterfuges or permissions, and at every point you had to pass some kind of checkpoints and so on and so forth. So it was not a small feat. That vehicle has not been bombed out. That is a functional vehicle which has been camouflaged to look as though it has been strafed. Okay? You can see there's a guy sitting with his feet out and he's eating lunch. All right? So yes, that was another, strafing and bombing was a constant danger during this trip. So that's the mine where the documents were hidden and later retrieved. And this is a picture of the slate quarry, and you can see there's a V2 motor being tested in a static stand over there on the left. That white stream, that's the exhaust. So this is where it's located, in the Thuringian Mountains, Thüringer Wald. So my father took 2 or 3 days leave during this trip to come to Lobositz and said to my mother, just pack necessities, we got to go. And she said, is it really that serious? Now, my mother, poor thing, had been taking care of Silesian refugees for several months now. They were coming through in large numbers, and we were quartering them in our house, the House Germania, where I was born. They were set, there was straw on the floor, and 50 peasants sleeping on the floor, and there were SS officers she had to quarter, and there were, military people. And all this was organized, cooking for these people and so on. So she'd been seeing the stream of refugees, and they had terrible stories. They had really awful stories about what it was like to be in a Russian-conquered zone. There were rapes and murders and beatings and all this kind of stuff. So these were not... why my mother thought there was still... that it was a good idea to stay or that things weren't so dire, I don't know. But anyway, my father finally convinced her, and we packed a few suitcases and crates, put a lot of stuff in storage, which we never saw again, and took off with this caravan for southern Germany. So what we took then was all we ever had. So a couple of suitcases, some clothes, some bedding, and a couple of handfuls of pictures. Most of the pictures I have are actually then retrieved from relatives who had them. So we were quartered because of the common bombing and strafing and danger from all that kind of stuff. The brass at Peenemuende decided that it was not a good idea to quarter everybody together, because then the whole group could be lost at once. So they distributed us among a number of small villages, and we were in the village of Brennersgrün, which you see up here. Picture taken in 1990 when I revisited. It's a little village. Brenner is a charcoal maker, and so this was a grün is a meadow. So this was sort of a middle elevation town, very picturesque. And we lived in the house of a forester, the town forester. The lifeblood of that area is slate mining. There's huge slate mines, and the slate shipped all over the world. If you have slate a house in Tallahassee, it could well have come from here. And every house there is covered with slate, as you can see. It's quite artful a lot of times. So this is the house we were quartered in. And initially we lived in a bedroom downstairs because the forester... The wife lived here. The forester was off in the army somewhere. But then this is where we saw the Americans come. So one day, it's everybody's. I don't remember if there was warning or not, but clearly the Americans were coming down the street. Guns at the ready, very tanks and trucks and soldiers with guns and so on. Very nervous. Everybody staying inside. We watched them come. And they took over the house and quartered. We had to move up into the garret room. And they moved into the room we'd been occupying downstairs, slept with their boots and their uniforms on. One of them had managed to buy or kill a cow. I think it was an old milk cow, and they wanted my mother to cut steaks from it, and she didn't even know what a steak was. So. And they couldn't finish this tough old steak, so they left a bunch of it. My father, in the meantime, and the whole technical group had fled further south to the foothills of the Alps, to Oberammergau, where they were holed up, waiting for the Americans to pass through, and then the plan was to give themselves up as a group, because they knew they had value as a group. My father, whose stomach was always very large, he and a friend went out one evening to scrounge for food to local farmyards, using his alcohol. And they got cut off from the rest of the group, and he was taken a prisoner of war. He was actually in uniform, so he and his friend were prisoners of war. Got separated from the group as a whole. And that began a very unpleasant episode in his life. and ours too, for that matter, because we didn't know where he was for more than 6 months. We had no idea whether he was alive or dead. But getting back to the slate quarry, I visited there in 1990, and the manager of the slate quarry was very worried. He thought that I was working for the press, and they'd had some kind of unpleasantry with the press. But that's what's left of the facilities today, a little brick building. And then the Russians, you can barely see where the test stand was in that slate quarry. The Russians dynamited it when they came, and there's almost nothing left to see. All this was abandoned, of course, when they fled to Oberammergau. When I visited there, I learned something which I guess shouldn't have been a surprise, that this slate quarry was also associated with a concentration camp. This is Camp Laura, it's called Laura. And 600 workers lived in that barn and worked in the slate quarries. My father says he doesn't recall seeing a lot of that. It was sort of off to the side, and I guess they were busy. Anyway, there were something like 2,000 concentration camps in Germany. It was not, you hear only about a few, but every town had them. They were everywhere. It was a slave labor system, basically, and the death camps are only one aspect of it. This village, Brennersgrün, became the last village between eastern and western Germany. I didn't know that at the time, but it's only about a half a kilometer from the village. So this is 1990, after the border came down, and that dandelion-strewn track there is the border, where that's a tank road, so that they could run tanks up and down the road. So that was an interesting finding. So with the end of the war, then, we became refugees, and we were moved to the town of Weiblingen in Württemberg, Baden-Württemberg, which you see on the map there. And we lived along with a lot of other families from this V2 group in an old school. There were 30 families to a schoolroom, and we slept on mattresses on the floor. Every family had a mattress and a little space around it for their goods, which we didn't have much of. And there was one spigot for cold water out in the hall. And what I remember is getting bathed. My mother, of course, being German, insisted on cleanliness, and I hated that. And it was cold, This is still late winter, early spring. And food was scarce and low quality. We ate mostly thin potato soup with turnips, and turnips with rutabagas, actually. They were Rüben, as they were called. And once a week we got noodles, and that was the only thing I would eat. My mother was desperate because I guess she thought I was going to die of starvation, which maybe she was right. The families had been in this Thuringen area, and the men had gone down to Oberammergau, which was further south. And they had surrendered to the Americans, and the Americans had taken over their families. And they'd moved us in army trucks, sitting on benches, I remember that, hard benches, moved us to Weiblingen, to this refugee camp. And from there, we lived there for several months. I don't remember how long. And from there, then they eventually quartered us in an old cavalry garrison in Landshut in Bavaria. I like this pair of slides because it shows you the effects of the stress of this time on my mother. Doesn't look like the same woman. And I'm not sure that she ever really recovered from this period. She had various tics and so on that characterized her later life. So my father, in the meantime, having gotten separated from the main group, had been put on a train to, by this time, the German army was surrendering by the tens of thousands, and the U.S. Army was shipping these prisoners of war to a number of different camps. The one at Heilbronn was where my father ended up. 250,000 German POWs in old potato field, basically, with no provision for anything much. Food was extremely scarce. A lot of soldiers had no shelter, and it was a tough time. It was sort of life reduced to its bare necessities and then less. From there, he was shipped out to a coal mine in Belgium as, ironically, slave labor, as what they called euphemistically reparations labor. And he worked in a coal mine down in shafts that you had to crawl on your hands and knees, kilometer or more underground. Now, in fairness, he worked side by side with Belgian coal miners whose conditions were obviously the same, at least while they were underground. But above ground, it wasn't the same at all. He was in a prisoner camp where the prisoners were given minimal care and so on and so forth. So he was there for about 6 months, and the U.S. Army, knowing he was one of the V2 group, wanted him as part of the group. So they put together what was then called the CID, Central Intelligence Division, Army intelligence officer, with a translator and a jeep driver, and they were looking for these two guys, Eberhard Spohn and my father, Johann Tschinkel. And the story of how they found them is so remarkable. The only clue they had was that at one of the stops on the train to Heilbronn, my father's friend Spohn had written a note addressed to his wife. He didn't know her exact whereabouts either, remember. The group had been moved, so he didn't know the whereabouts. And while the train was stopped in the station, had leaned out and given it to a passerby and said, "Please see if you can get this to my wife." And the wife got it. And she turned it over to the Army. And the Army had this basic clue. And the note said, "We are going west on a train in this town." And that's all they knew. And then the record keeping was dismal, as you can imagine. When you get 250,000 POWs in a period of a month or two, record keeping is not easy, especially since they didn't have computers. So they traced him somehow from there up to Belgium, to Mons. And one day, the announcement came over the loudspeaker, "Is there a Johann Tschinkel here? If so, please report to the office," or whatever. And he thought, geez, this could be bad or it could be good. He had no idea. So finally he decided that he would report, and was this Army officer, and they said, "Well, we want to offer you a contract to work in the U.S. on rockets." And he must have thought he died and go to heaven, There wasn't, to put it mildly, there wasn't much future for a rocket scientist in post-war Germany, right? So anyway, he came back by that time we were in Landshut in Bavaria, not far from Munich, and he stayed only 2 weeks. He was a skeleton. He was emaciated. My mother didn't have a pot big enough to cook enough potatoes for him to eat, so he stayed only 2 weeks, and then he was on the first ship that took the technical people to the United States. It was a year before the first families followed. So the rocket scientists were moved as a group of men only, and then a year later the Army began moving the families over too. So he was only home for a couple of weeks. I do remember seeing when he arrived. I recognized him. My brother didn't, oddly. So for my father, one of the most significant events in prisoner of war camp was that he befriended a man by the name of Grieshaber, who was an artist. And he had been imprisoned by the Nazis, actually. He'd been in a concentration camp. And the U.S. Army didn't know what to do with him, so they stuck him in a prisoner of war camp. Very logical, right? This poor fellow had nothing. My father had a half of a pup tent, and his friend Spohn had another half, so the two of them together could put one complete shelter together. And this guy had nothing, just the clothes on his back. So they invited him to sleep with them. And it was a lifelong friendship. And Grieshaber went on to become one of the most important German artists of modern Germany. He had been imprisoned by the Nazis because he was said to have produced what they called degenerate art, entartete Kunst, as they called it. And they didn't like people like that. He was modern. And in POW camp, somehow he scrounged together the tools. He got some wood from packing crate ends and using the strapping around, or that comes around boxes. They cut some of that up and sharpened it so that he could make the tools to make wood blocks. And then my father made the ink from fat and charcoal and other pigments. And on wrapping paper, he printed this little booklet called The Big Show in the ETO, the European Theater of Operations. And it's in English because Grieshaber actually could speak English. So this thing, I still have it. It's extremely valuable now, of course. My father had a copy of it. There are only 3 copies in existence, I think. And it's an opinion piece about Germany at the end of the war. And it's, well, if you're interested, I can share it with you later. But one of the panels is people that can, the lower right there, people that can never show their face again. And this is sort of conditions in the camp, the economic cesspool. And a quote from Ben Franklin, which is, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." So Grieshaber was clearly not of the Nazi persuasion. That's the man in 1966. We had a long correspondence with him, and his letters are just charming. Oh, I need to say that they went through terrible times after the war, almost starvation. And my parents would send packages, care packages, to them on a regular basis and help them out. So there developed this sort of intense and long-term friendship. And his letters were charming because they were always, being an artist, half of them were drawn. There were pictures, and then the writing over them, and it was quite creative. Anyway, I still have all those too. That's the location of the coal mine. I've already told you about that. This is probably a good point to end. The sequel to the story, and this is now we go after World War II, is that the U.S. Army collected all these technical people and brought them to the United States, first to Fort Bliss, Texas, where we were housed in an annex to the Beaumont Hospital. The annex was for soldiers recuperating from wounds, so there were long wooden barracks joined by ramps, not stairs, no stairs, so you could wheel wheelchairs, and covered ramps with linoleum floors that, again, for wheelchairs, and wonderful for roller skating. That's what we did there. Just terrific. The change of ecology from central Germany to Fort Bliss to western Texas was, of course, astounding. And we loved it. It was like paradise, especially for us kids. For 4 years, we lived in a barbed wire enclosure. We had to have a pass to get in and out. We were limited to 10 annual trips to El Paso, always under guard from the U.S. military. And don't think that it was because they were protecting us. They were protecting their investment. Right? The military had made a large investment in this program, and they didn't want it messed up. The rocketry was based on V-2s that they had captured and transported to the U.S. after the war. So the first 4 years were really just sort of fiddling with the V-2 and doing things like setting altitude records by 2-stage rockets and so on and so forth. There's the rockets being transported. By now, this is in Belgium, actually, so they transported by ship to the USA. The man most instrumental in putting together this group was Major Hamill, whom you see on the left there. By this time this is in the 60s, no, 58. By this time he's back in civilian uniform, but he was a much beloved man. Everybody liked him a lot. He was just a very good organizer and a good human being. The man who later came to be in command of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville was General Toftoy, the other man there, seen with Werner von Braun. So the operation had moved these people, and not just the V2 group, but there was the largest group. It's called Operation Paperclip. And there's lots of paper clippers around. They weren't all rocket scientists. All kinds of technical and scientific people came to the U.S. after the war on Operation Paperclip. Basically, it was war booty. And this is the group of V2 rocket scientists at White Sands Proving Grounds, 100 miles north of Fort Bliss in the New Mexican desert. That's where they did the rocket shots here in the USA after the war. And my father's indicated there. There's actually a website. This is pretty neat. There's a website where if you move the cursor over each face, it tells you who it is. And I mean, I recognize fully a third of these people. You know, they were the fathers of my friends and so on. So that was kind of neat. So these are the barracks where we lived. There's a hospital annex. And that's a close-up of the barracks. The first year, without families, the men had a great time. They built a clubhouse, they did gardening, they played volleyball, they went swimming, and then on the side they did some work on rockets, right? But the funds really hadn't been fully allocated yet, and it wasn't a whole lot of work to do. This is, well, Kurt Debus was, he became later the chief of launching and handling, was the guy that fired all the Apollo rockets and all the Saturns, the moon, and so on and so forth. I always liked this guy, not only because he had this beautiful daughter whom I mean, she was way above my level, but because he had been a member of a German fraternity at a time when it was fashionable to have scars from saber fighting. But the whole thing was fake, and he had a scar right now. You can see it in his picture. The whole thing was fake because when they fought with sabers, there's a mask that covers all of the face except the two parts of the cheek where they're supposed to get the scars, right? So it wasn't life-threatening. It's not like they were fighting over a woman or anything like that. But sort of a romantic figure. That's the White Sands Proving Grounds. An aerial view was pretty small at that time. This is a rocket being prepared, and the next slide shows, I think, two different, the one on the right is a combination of a WAC Corporal and a V2, and this set an altitude record of over 100 miles, had a camera in it, and it was the first shot into space, really, done from White Sands Proving Grounds. One thing that we weren't accustomed to was the temperatures in Fort Bliss. Germans love their candles at Christmas time, and you can see what happened to them. Remember, this is before air conditioning, and the temperatures typically often went over 100, 110. And that's why a swimming pool was very welcome. This was the pool at the Jester Trailer Park, which was right next to the compound where we lived, and later on we also swam there. I remember it very vividly. It was great fun. It's where I learned how to swim. And then the apartments were remodeled, the barracks were remodeled into small apartments, probably, 500 square feet or something like that each. And that's where we lived for 4 years. And we grew gardens and we played, and the desert around, we'd dig under the fence and play in the desert, and, it wasn't high security after all. You could dig under it, and we'd play around the old V2 that were stockpiled there, crawl inside the engine compartments, and we constructed forts and had rock fights, and I hit a friend of mine in the eye once with a big rock, and that was all great fun. Then in the summer, the first summer we were there, the Army organized a class for all us children to learn English, so that's what we're doing here. And you can see me on the extreme right. That's me, my sister next to me, and we learned English in about 6 weeks. So after that, we spoke English, and I think my English isn't bad, is it? It's pretty good. That's my brother's class. He was 3 years older, so it's the older kids. And then first we went to into El Paso to go to elementary school. This was the Davy Crockett Elementary School where I started in the first grade. I was supposed to be in the second grade, but because I didn't speak English, they put me in the first grade. Another stroke of logic. But eventually we went to school in the Army schools on the Fort Bliss base. My father had always been interested in gardening, so he rented 2 acres of bottomland along the Rio Grande River and started an irrigated truck farm. Sold the vegetables on the market and sold the vegetables to all the other German families in this compound. That's me helping, or supposedly helping. The only story my father ever told about my help was when I turned the irrigation water the wrong way and flooded the field and ruined the tomato crop. He's a father, you know. What can I say? And there were a lot of outings to the mountains of New Mexico. It was a lot of fun. White Sands National Monument was my personal favorite. Okay, and this would be a good place to stop because I've way gone beyond my time. The project eventually, the Army had been lobbying Congress during the Fort Bliss period to fund an intercontinental missile program. And finally, in 1950, the Congress did fund that program. And the whole thing was moved to Huntsville, Alabama, so we left Fort Bliss for Huntsville. So this is a good place to stop, and I know I've gone over my time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.